Hello and welcome along to the next part of the course. Here we're going to be looking at the industry analysis for the MCS management case study of August 2018. We're focusing on the digital camera industry because of course we're dealing with the company Montel in this particular pre-scene, and Montel is a major manufacturer of digital cameras. So the idea is to familiarize you with some of the key facts, figures and trends from the real world digital camera industry. The idea is that you will be better placed then to anticipate some of the issues and question types that might come up on exam day, and indeed you'll be more familiar with some of the key concepts and ideas and terms as well that might be used in the unseen material on exam day. And so we'll start with an overview of what we're going to be covering in this industry analysis. So first we will start with product analysis, and we will look in particular at two major categories within the camera industry, the digital camera industry: the CSCs, which are mentioned in the pre-scene, or mirrorless cameras, and then the DSLRs on the other hand. This is a really important contrast and distinction. These are two of the most important segments currently in this industry, and we'll see why in both sections 1 and section 2. And we'll be looking at consumer preferences as well, and how consumers perceive these different product types. From there, then we'll move into section 2, and we'll be looking at the macro trends, sales and revenue figures from recent years, and the various segments within this industry. The reason we're leaving this until section 2 is because we'll better be able to interpret some of these trends in light of what we have found out from the product analysis in section 1. In section 3 then, we will look at real-world companies. In particular, we're going to focus on Canon here, the major manufacturer of digital cameras, and perhaps even Canon has become synonymous with digital cameras. It's certainly amongst the professionals and those who are in the know. Canon is the leader, the market leader, the one that everyone is aspiring to be like, and so for that reason it's a very good idea to do a deep dive on Canon, look at its operations in some detail, what it's doing right, where it might be going wrong, and then using that information perhaps to shed light on the company of Montel in the pre-scene. Indeed, there are many reasons to think that Canon might be roughly, Montel is roughly modelled on Canon, the real world case. From there we will move into section 4, and we're going to be looking at some opportunities, challenges and threats faced by companies within the digital camera industry. There's some really interesting developments going on in this industry, and we're going to look at the key challenges and indeed opportunities that a company like Montel would be facing at this particular time. And from there then we'll conclude and just tie together some of the key issues that we have been looking at in this industry analysis. Okay, so let's get started on the products. So DSLR, this is one of the most common terms in the industry, and you'll have come across it several times if you've already read the pre-scene. But here we're going to, I'm sure you're already aware of the basics of what a DSLR is, but here we're going to just look at the actual internal mechanisms, and this will give you a better idea of what exactly is involved in a DSLR camera. As you can see here in this diagram, the light enters from the left through the lens. So lenses, of course, are not unique to DSLR cameras. These detachable or interchangeable lenses, you can get them for other camera types as well. So in comes the light through these very complex lenses. You can see here internally there are several different lenses within the actual lens structure, and that is to offer the user the opportunity to change the focus, and that is a really complex mechanism in and of itself. But we're going to move into the actual body of the camera here, and the first point at which the light meets is this mirror here. This is the shutter mirror, and the function of the mirror here is to reflect the light up into the viewfinder, which you can see there at the top right. So this light is coming in through the lens and then is being reflected upwards into the viewfinder, and this allows the user, the photographer, then to look in through the viewfinder and see exactly what is coming in through the lens. In other words, they're seeing what is actually produced by the lens's configuration, the particular zoom setting of the lens, and they can see exactly what is being projected and what will be projected onto the image sensor then, which sits in behind that mirror. So when the photographer actually presses the button to take the picture, what happens is that mirror is momentarily lifted up, And that produces that characteristic clicking sound, which is really the shutter opening and closing when you take a picture. And when that when that mirror is lifted up in that mechanism, the light can then be allowed to hit this image sensor behind. There, the image is processed, and then it is eventually stored in digital form. You can also see here at the bottom of this image, you have this AF sensor, which is an autofocus sensor. So the mirror itself, which is above, is actually translucent, which allows some light to go through to a sub mirror which sits in behind, and that is reflected then down into the autofocus sensor. And the autofocus sensor then allows the camera to automatically adjust the lens so as to correct for any blurring which may be occurring. Maybe as a result of movement, for example, or movement outside the camera. And this is then fed back into the electronics of the camera at the back, and it is corrected for, and that is processed along with the image that is projected onto the sensor. So it is quite a complex machine. That is a very basic overview of how exactly a DSLR works, but you can see that that mirror segment in the middle there takes up a great deal of the space in the actual body, and it is crucial for allowing the photographer to see exactly what is seen by the lens, so to speak, which is out there on the left at the front. Now, advantages of DSLRs over traditional point and shoots. There are several. You can see what you shoot. As I mentioned, as a DSLR is constructed with reflex mirrors, which means that you look through the lens instead of a see-through hole in the camera. So in other words, you're seeing exactly what the lens is seeing, which allows you to take your shots more accurately and to be completely in touch and in tune with the image that is about to be taken. You also get better quality images in general with DSLRs. DSLRs tend to be the most advanced cameras out there. Typically a much bigger sensor in DSLRs than a typical point and shoot camera. Point and shoot typically has a sensor area that is only about 3 to 5% of a full frame DSLR sensor, so really much larger sensors there. Having a big sensor, of course, helps to get images that have much less noise, and that what that means is noise is the grain you typically see in a picture, and therefore allowing overall better image quality. Other advantages, shutter and focus speeds. DSLRs can acquire focus very quickly and take multiple shots per second. You have very fast shutter mechanisms in the most advanced DSLRs. They're capable of capturing up to 10 frames per second, and all professional action and sports photography is these days done with SLR cameras, or at least that's how it's been up until very recently, as we'll see later. Ability to use different lenses, of course. There's the capacity to interchange different lens types, which can be mounted and used on different DSLRs, from super wide angle to telephoto lenses, depending on the needs of the photographer. As we'll see, this capacity to use interchangeable lenses is not exclusive to DSLRs, but it is an advantage of DSLRs over those traditional point and shoot cameras. You see what you shoot, as I mentioned, and you have full control over depth of field. You're fully in charge of isolating foreground from background to bring everything into focus through the aperture control of the lens. And some portrait and telephoto lenses can really isolate objects and create that distinctive creamy and blurry background that you get, which is also known as bokeh. Now, what is the CSC, or the mirrorless? Here you can see a very, very illustrative photograph of two cameras, one DSLR on the left, the other the mirrorless on the right. And the size difference is considerable, very, very noticeable there. The DSLR is almost twice the size in terms of its thickness compared to the mirrorless, and we're going to go into the reasons why that's the case just now. Don't be confused, by the way, by the jargon. Mirrorless and CSCs are used interchangeably. Mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless is probably the more common term, really, within the dialect of camera discussions and camera articles and so on that you'll find online. But in the pre-scene, they use the CSC version. But don't be confused by that. They're essentially the same thing. As the CSC name indicates, which is the compact system camera, the camera bodies of mirrorlesses are considerably smaller than DSLRs. And why is that the case? These cameras do not use the reflex mirror system that we saw in the previous images, and so do not have to house the shutter mechanism of the DSLR allowing for a much smaller body. You recall from that image, that cross-section that we saw in the case of the DSLR, most of the space was actually taken up by that shutter mechanism in the middle, and so when you cut that out, of course, you get to save on a huge amount of space, and that's exactly what you see in the case of the mirrorless there on the right. Here's another overview and a compare and contrast of the whole process. You can see the DSLR there on the right, a much more complex, involved process, lots of different refractions going on, and the light is going to several different places, and it's all very complex and bulky. On the right then you see the mirrorless, by contrast, much more seamless, much more simple, and for that reason it can be much smaller than the DSLR, and in general as a result much lighter as well, for various other reasons which we'll see in a moment. Now these mirrorless cameras, they use what are called electronic viewfinders. In the case of the DSLRs, as you recall, those were optical viewfinders. In other words, you were actually seeing the light that was literally coming in through the lens. But in the case of these compact system cameras, or these mirrorless cameras, they use an electronic viewfinder. And what this means is the user is seeing the image captured by the sensor. They're not actually seeing the light that is coming in through the lens. And then when the sensor captures the light, which is directly focused through the lens onto the sensor without any intermediary mirrors getting in the way, this is then relayed to a viewfinder at the top of the camera, usually mounted on top, as you can see in the image on the right there. So the person is actually seeing the processed image, which has already been captured and processed by the sensor. There are several advantages of CSCs or mirrorless cameras over DSLRs, as we'll see now, and this is taking it from the consumer or user's point of view. Since their introduction in the early 2000s, CSCs have gradually caught up with DSLRs in terms of ability to capture high quality images. There is an ongoing debate within the industry, and this is really interesting if you look at it through various articles online. There is a raging debate as to whether or not CSCs are better or comparable to DSLRs in terms of the quality. There's a great deal, as we'll see later, there's a great deal of kind of customer loyalty that goes with this industry and with these products. We'll come back to that at a later point. But certainly it is actually debatable, and it is arguable that the CSCs have actually already caught up with DSLRs in terms of their capacity to take the highest quality images. The electronic viewfinder, as we just saw, it displays what the actual photo will look like as opposed to what comes through the lens. So the idea here is basically that because it's actually the sensor image that is being displayed in these electronic viewfinders, the user sees basically exactly what they're going to get when they click the button and take the actual photo. Whereas in the case of the optical viewfinder, you're seeing the light that is being transmitted through the lens. You're seeing what the lens is seeing rather than seeing what the actual sensor captures. And so for that reason, there might be more of a disparity between what you see through a DSLR and the final image, as opposed to what you see through the EVF or electronic viewfinder on a CSC and the final image. Generally, you're going to get exactly what you see in the electronic viewfinder, whereas in the case of the DSLR, you might not get exactly what you thought you were going to get when you're looking through that optical viewfinder. EVFs in general as well are better in low light, as they can correct for low light conditions in a way that optical lenses cannot. So the idea here is that, again, if you're looking through an optical lens on a DSLR, you see exactly the light that comes in through the lens, whereas in the case of electronic viewfinders on these CSCs, these mirrorless cameras, you can actually have the sensors and the electronics that go along with the sensors correct for low light conditions in such a way that you can actually see better what you're going to get, and again you're going to see that final product. More consumer perspectives on these CSCs versus DSLRs. CSCs are obviously smaller and lighter, which was mentioned earlier, making them easier to carry, better for traveling, for example, and for taking shots spontaneously or on the go. CSCs have no shutter mechanism and so can shoot more silently. That is a really important feature as well, actually, because when you take a DSLR, typically you're going to hear that shutter going every time you take a shot. There are DSLRs that include silent mechanisms or silence modes, but it's generally agreed that they're never completely silent. You can always just about make out that little shutter noise. And so, for example, for people who might be into nature photography, a CSC has that distinct advantage of not potentially disturbing the subject of the shoot, for example, in the case of wildlife. And so that seems to be another big advantage of the CSCs over the traditional DSLRs. Though DSLRs generally have a wider range of lenses available, in principle, CSCs can have as wide a range of lenses, most CSCs being interchangeable lens cameras as well. And so the point here is that basically because DSLRs have been around for much longer, and because the professional camera has become established as the DSLR for so long, and it's been on the scene for so long compared to the CSC, for that reason a huge array of lenses has amassed that are compatible with these DSLR cameras, and the CSCs are relatively recent on the scene, as we'll see, and for that reason it's suggested that there just aren't as many options out there for the lenses in terms of lenses currently. However, that is beginning to change. We're beginning to see a shift in terms of the production of lenses. More and more CSCs are being made, CSC compatible lenses I should say, and so it may be the case that that will no longer be the case within the coming years. There are also advantages of CSCs over DSLRs from the perspective of manufacturers, a very important consideration, of course, from the perspective of the case study. Mirrorless cameras have fewer moving parts than DSLRs, making the production process less complex and less prone to defects potentially, therefore. So you remember you had that big mechanism housed within the body of the DSLR, that shutter mechanism with those mirrors, and the shutter speeds being really, really important, how quickly that shutter lifts the mirror so that there's no disparity between what you see through that viewfinder and what you actually get in terms of the final photo. It's a very delicate process. It takes a great deal of production, care, and assembly and design and consideration, and of course it also is making those cameras bulkier. But if the manufacturer can be shifted more towards those CSCs, that cuts out a huge amount of labor and indeed complexity and planning complexity, and indeed the potential for mistakes and defects. Those electronic viewfinders are created using sophisticated electronics, and this gives companies that are already well situated in the electronics industry as a whole a competitive advantage, and several companies within this industry, in the digital camera industry, are already big players in other areas of electronics and are very, very innovative on that front. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, and indeed Samsung. To a lesser extent, of course, as Samsung wouldn't be as big a player in the digital camera field, but certainly Sony and Panasonic, they produce a good range of digital cameras, and they're very well placed to take advantage of those electronics capabilities that they have, and this allows them to be better placed then to move into this CSC segment, because of course the capturing and the relaying of the image to the electronic viewfinders is wholly dependent on those electronic systems, and the quicker those electronic systems are, the more sophisticated they are, the better it is in terms of the electronic viewfinder, because it allows that electronic viewfinder to present an image that is more immediately in track and in sync with what is actually being brought in through that lens, and that allows for a more accurate picture to be taken. Are there any disadvantages of mirrorless? Yes, there are some disadvantages. There can be a time lag, as I just suggested, between the sensor and the electronic viewfinder, especially if the system applies corrective effects to the image displayed on the viewfinder. That is especially the case in low light conditions. As I said before, an advantage of the electronic viewfinder on the CSCs is that they can correct for low light conditions, and so the person can better see exactly what they're shooting in low light conditions through that electronic viewfinder than through a traditional optical DSLR viewfinder. However, it does potentially create time lags, because of course the sensors and the electronics in the back of the camera are going to have to actually correct for those low light conditions, and then that obviously creates a disparity between what's actually hitting the sensor and what the person is seeing in the electronic viewfinder. Another potential disadvantage of mirrorless cameras versus DSLRs is that, as I mentioned, currently there is a more limited range of hardware available for mirrorless cameras in terms of lenses, etc., and other components that you might want to add. And finally, This more compact body, this is probably the most important disadvantage of the mirrorless cameras versus the DSLRs. This generally means the smaller body means a smaller battery and so reduced battery life. Characteristically, you will see on these mirrorless cameras that they have much smaller batteries compared to those massive DSLR bodies. The DSLR bodies are able to generally take on a bigger battery and so can last much longer than those CSCs. In many ways, this is a kind of a design restriction as much as anything, because of course you could imagine that the manufacturer, if they wished, they could simply attach as big a battery as they wanted onto the side of the camera. But really, this is an ergonomics and a design limitation, as I suggested, because of course you don't want the camera to look ugly and cumbersome, and of course if you stick a massive battery on the side of a small camera it's going to look a bit strange. But also in terms of balance and ergonomics and usability, cameras generally, you want them to be compact, you want them to be balanced and in equilibrium so that it is not hard for the person to manipulate the camera and to keep it still, for example, if they're taking very sensitive photographs. And so for that reason, it wouldn't really make sense to have a big unwieldy battery weighing it down on one side or on the other, at the bottom or at the top. It would definitely reduce the capacity of that camera to take versatile shots. And for that reason, primarily, that's the reason why you see much smaller batteries on these CSC cameras. Key points to take away from this section then. As we will see, DSLRs remain the dominant camera type in terms of market share, but things may be changing very interestingly, as we'll see in the next section on the macro trends. DSLRs are still the camera of choice for most professionals, with Canon's DSLRs considered the best of the best, the creme de la creme, as we'll come back to Canon later on. CSCs, however, are making inroads due to the several obvious advantages that they hold over DSLRs, which we've just outlined. And consumers in this industry, as I suggested earlier, they manifest high degrees of both brand and model loyalty, that is to say DSLR versus CSCs or Canon versus Nikon, for example, which probably accounts for the delay of the transition to CSCs. CSCs were introduced first back in the early 2000s, so they haven't been, it's not exactly a very, very new technology. They've been around for approximately 15 years. But there has been a relatively slow transition, and that may be a reflection of that fact that we see a huge degree of brand and model loyalty within this industry. Okay, so we're moving now on to the quantitative or macro trends. We're looking at sales and revenues in recent years, and indeed we'll be looking at segments within this analysis. We're starting with a really interesting graph here. This is a very, very telling and insightful graph for many reasons. The title here, Have Digital Camera Sales Bottomed Out? We'll come back to that in a second. Why is that the case? Well, look here at 2017. We've seen a very radical and steady downward trend since 2010. Year on year, we've seen this shrinking market in these digital cameras. And unsurprisingly, that has a huge amount to do with the emergence of the smartphone, the ubiquity of the smartphone, and the fact that smartphones' cameras, the quality of those cameras, has been rapidly increasing, especially in the last 5 to 6 years. There is a huge amount of competition now with amongst smartphone producers about the quality of the cameras, and indeed you'll see in most of the advertising now for new smartphones that are being released, one of the most prominent features that is advertised is the quality of the camera, how many megapixels it has, various features of the camera, various innovations in the cameras, and how they're better than the competitors. So really the camera has become kind of co-opted by the smartphone industry, at least the camera for everyday use and for the non-specialist. That is where it is no longer in demand as a separate product. It has been largely integrated and consumed by the smartphone industry, and for that reason we've seen a huge plummet in sales of digital cameras in general, specifically cameras with built-in lenses. You can see in this diagram here, the blue, that represents those cameras with built-in lenses, and they have absolutely plummeted in terms of the year-on-year sales and manufacture. We're down there in 2016 at a low point of 24.2 million. But very interestingly here, you can see that there is this slight rebound in 2016 to 2017, from 24.2 million units shipped in 2016 to 25 million units shipped in 2017. This has been the subject of raging debate within this industry. Analysts, experts within this industry cannot figure out why there has been this slight uptick in 2017. There's a huge amount of confusion because it was generally agreed and generally the consensus was that this industry was dying, that the especially built-in lens digital camera industry was only going to continue its rapid decrease in 2017 and 2018. But we've seen this strange little blip, this upward tick in 2017, and there is still a wide amount of dispute and disagreement as to whether or not this is actually indicative of a recovery, whether or not this is simply a blip or an anomaly in the long-term trend, whether it's just going to return in 2018 to a decline back into that trend that we've seen since 2010, 2011. Note here above, we can see this graph is divided into two segments. We have the cameras with built-in lenses, as I mentioned, on the left in the blue, and then the red represents the cameras with interchangeable lenses. This is an important thing to observe here. Look, back in 2004, in terms of the share and the amount of the absolute numbers of cameras with interchangeable lenses being produced versus the cameras with built-in lenses. 2004, this market was absolutely overwhelmingly dominated by those cameras with built-in lenses, those digital cameras. Those small digital cameras back into the mid-2000s were still very, very, very widely used and purchased by people relative to other camera types. They were used for personal uses, for holiday photos, for everyday photos, for various personal events. And that it continued to grow throughout 2005, 6, 7, 8. And then this was when the smartphone started to come on the scene. And you could see there, that's where the effect started to kick in after 2010 in a major way. That blue segment just absolutely plummets, shoots down right through 2015, 2016. And that is very much tied up with the emergence of the smartphone, as I said. But interestingly, the share and the numbers of the interchangeable lens cameras has had a relatively healthy period in those same 5 to 6 years. You can see actually that the share from 2013, 2014, 15, 16, 17, obviously the share has increased relative to the cameras with built-in lenses, but in terms of absolute numbers as well, it actually hasn't fallen as much as one might have expected and has been relatively steady for the last 3 to 4 years in terms of absolute numbers of units produced of cameras with interchangeable lenses. Those interchangeable lens cameras are generally the preserve of specialists, of professional photographers and amateur enthusiasts who would be really interested in high quality and spending hundreds if not thousands on the equipment. And so that has actually been relatively stable over the last 5 years or so. We'll come back to that. That's an important point as well to bear in mind, but certainly that cameras with built-in lenses, it does seem to be on a steady decline despite this blip here from 2016 to 2017. We'll come back to that and trying to figure out what exactly might be the cause of that in further slides. Now we're looking at the lenses industry in particular. In the previous section we were looking, or the previous slide I should say, we were looking at the actual camera units themselves. Now we're looking at those interchangeable lenses that can be purchased independently and separately and used with different kinds of cameras. We're seeing a rise from 2010 to 2012. Then from that point we see a steady enough decline here. But back again, we're seeing that little blip from 2016 to 2017. We've seen that slight recovery in the lens industry, or the lens segment of this industry, I should say. So more people, it seems, are buying interchangeable lenses in 2017 compared to 2016. You'll notice as well, this drop isn't quite as dramatic as the previous slide, and of course that's an indication of the fact that, as I said, those interchangeable lenses generally are used for those cameras that are used by professionals, by amateur enthusiasts, and so that has not plummeted and suffered quite as much as has the cameras which have actual fixed lenses, don't have those interchangeable lenses, because of course those are being squeezed out by the smartphones, which more or less serve the cameras of which serve the same purpose as those digital cameras would once have back in, say, the early 2000s. So not as radical a decline in the lens segment, and indeed a slight blip upwards in 2017 in line with the general industry uptick in 2017, which has largely mystified analysts. Let's come back then to this DSLR versus mirrorless CSCs segment, and we'll look at some of the numbers here in the last 5 years or so. We're seeing that decline here in DSLR, and we're seeing a relative increase in those mirrorless. Now look there, you can see that the jump really has happened in the last 2 years or so, from 3.1 2016 right up to 4.1 in terms of millions of cameras manufactured. And what this represents is a 32% increase in mirrorless cameras produced over that 5-year period, and a 9% drop in DSLR cameras manufactured. Is this an indication of a sea change in the industry? Are we finally seeing the mirrorless catching up with, beginning to catch up with DSLRs? Are these mirrorless CSC cameras actually going to completely phase out those DSLRs because of those features that we saw in the previous section? All of those advantages that the mirrorless cameras seem to have over the traditional DSLR with its optics and its optical viewfinder. Certainly the trends are finally seeming to indicate that that is the case. You can see in 2013, 2014 and 15, it was only a modest growth in the mirrorless cameras, 3 million to 3.1 million to 3.2 million. But now we've seen that jump to 4.1, representing a 32% increase since 2013 in mirrorless cameras being produced. 4.1 million versus 7.5 million DSLRs. DSLRs, of course, still in terms of majority market share, they're still there, but the signs are that they're losing that edge, and the mirrorless are really making strides. So important to bear that in mind. And here we look at it in a little bit more detail. We're looking at the market share per product category. We've got mirrorless cameras, DSLRs, and again, we've got those non-interchangeable lens cameras brought back in here. Interestingly, as you can see, the non-interchangeable lens cameras have largely dominated still within the segment, because they are of course cheaper and more affordable, and for that reason they still managed in the last 5 to 6 years to maintain a majority of the market share, but they've plummeted relative to the other segments. We're way down to 52%, 53.6%. That jump again, mysterious, strange, anomalous jump from 2016 to 2017. Importantly though, look at those DSLR numbers. As we saw, the share, it's shrinking. It's from 21, 24, 28, 34, but then back down to 30 in 2017. And importantly, you can see that the mirrorless are making their move finally, 13% to 16.4% there in 2017.